Well, I can introduce Will. Will
Please.
is our expert in ground nesting bees. In fact, his favorite quote is bees need dirt. Basically, he will be able to explain where to look for ground nesting bees, why they're so important, and what we can do to protect them. Having said that, Will, if you're ready, go ahead.
All right, here we go. In a hole in the ground, there lived Halictus. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole lined with scraps of cellophane to stop the marsh from seeping in. That's Calides. Nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole filled with bits of rock and flies in the larder. That's Bimbex. It was a Halictus hole, and that means a vertical shaft dug through well-drained soil with little chambers off to either side to keep your eggs and sisters in. If you're a bee, a Halictus hole means comfort. So welcome to the Pollinator Underground. I'm Will Peterman, and about 30 years ago, I quit a promising career thinking about how bees think about food to come up here and mess around with software. I quit the software too, eventually, but I never really quit thinking about bees. I spent a few years doing photography and a few more years doing population surveys, and now I'm a board member of the Washington Native Bee Society and a volunteer with the Washington Bee Atlas. So now I'm probably thinking about bees as much as I ever have, but I got out of the habit of talking about them, at least in any formal way. So I'm trying to pick that up again. And I should probably start with some context for this talk. I gave a version of it as part of the Science on Tap series last year, and it went reasonably well. And the board asked me to repeat the presentation here. And the original plan was to give the talk at the August meeting when nobody shows up. But it turns out that this is the August meeting this year, so that didn't work. And I say that partially as a warning that this will be a more informal talk than we usually do, but also to let you know that we're depending on y'all to capture the spirit of the original venue. So I'm going to have to ask you all to imagine that we started serving beer about an hour ago.
Got
So
it.
ever since the first time I started talking about bees, my go-to move has always been to spend half an hour making introductions to some of the pretty ones. But honestly, we don't have time to do them justice. At last count, there are about 600 species in Washington, and I don't have pictures of all of them, but I have enough to use up all my time this evening and then some. And incidentally, I say the last count because for the first time, we've actually started counting. So there will be a next count, and the number will probably change. And I'll talk about that later. So what I want to do instead is to see if I can bring a little focus to the start of our conversation. I'm going to start with the big picture, why bees matter. And then I'm going to draw it back into the urban and suburban spaces where most of us are right now. I'll tell a couple stories about them, draw a couple of broad generalizations, and tell you a couple of things that you can do to help the bees at your house. So, okay. The big picture is the reason that bees matter is that sex works and plants can't move. One of the great winning strategies in the history of life is to move genetic material from one thing to another thing and combine them to make a third thing. But plants run into trouble when the other thing is way over yonder and, well, they've put down roots. And the oldest trick, probably the original trick, is just to throw a bunch of pollen in the air and hope for the best. And it works okay if you've got a lot of relatives in the neighborhood. So grasses, pine trees, they all still do it today. But it turns out to be more efficient to bribe something with wings to do the work for you. I mean, feet will do, but it's wings that really get the job done. And more than anything else, bees have adapted to be enthusiastic volunteers. They're good at carrying pollen, good at finding their way around, good at forming opinions about which kind of flower to visit next. And that last bit turns out to be really important because pollination only works when you go from one flower to another of its kin. If there's 20 kinds of flowers and you just kind of hop around, the plants might as well go back to blowing in the wind. And bees are so dedicated to the gig that they have become obligate pollen collectors. If their larvae don't get pollen to eat, they die. So bees have become the most reliable way for plants to make more plants. And that turns out to be important because plants are how the rest of us convert sunlight into not being dead. So with their laser focus on collecting pollen, bees have become one of the major threads in the web of life. Because there's a catch. For a mammal, and for most things really, not all plants are created equal. A loaf of bread, a jug of wine, that could be a really romantic evening. Or it could be a harbinger of the pollinator apocalypse. And that's because out of all the plants that we regularly eat, the grasses that we use to make bread and other starchy things, and the grapes that we use to make wine are among the very few that don't depend on insect pollination. They're old school, they use the wind. Now, you may have heard that 1 out of every 3 bites of food depends on pollinators. People say that a lot, and it isn't wrong, but I think we can do better. I prefer to think of a sandwich. The crops that go into the bread will survive the end of pollinators. That's because they have something else in common. Most of them are types of grass. They're very starchy and they'll grow almost anywhere. Carbohydrates are carbon and water. They're literally made out of air and rain and sunshine. That's it. Modern grass farming converts sunlight into calories on an industrial scale. They're very good at it, and it's going to be okay. Our bodies are not going to run out of energy. But here's the catch. You can run a body on starch, but you can't make one. To build you need to make proteins. And building a protein requires elements that aren't present in the air or in the water. Ultimately, they come out of the soil. And for whatever reason, the plants that we use to get nutrients out of the dirt and into our bodies, or into a chicken or what have you, they depend on insect pollinators, mostly bees. So if the bees go, they're going to take the middle of your sandwich with them, all of it. And I should say there is one exception. Fish, especially ocean fish, don't really rely on pollinators. So, a jug of wine and a dry fish sandwich. Coming soon to dystopian theater near you. So why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because there aren't enough bees to go around, and the more we want them, the fewer there are. And this is what that looks like. There's only 2 things that you need to know to read this map. The first is that the bees are colored blue. The second is that this isn't one of those annoying maps where the colors are scaled to make little changes look big. The yellow end of the scale is 0. Yellow means that on average, if you go out during bloom season and set out bowl traps to attract the attention of passing bees, the number of bees that you catch per acre per day is nothing at all. Now, looking at the map, the first thing you'll notice is that bees love deserts, and that's true. It's not great for farming, but it's good for bees. The second thing is that this is not a map of habitat, not really. The yellow isn't a map of grass or forest or whatever. This is a map of human activity. It's a map of land clearance and pesticide use. The more intensively we farm, the fewer bees we leave behind. And it does get pretty bad. I've worked on farms in the Wenatchee Valley where every single bee was a hired hand, brought in on a flatbed truck. If we ever learn to speak the waggle dance, they'll be eligible to join the UFW and strike for better working conditions. But without commercial honeybees, these farmers wouldn't have a crop. And the supply of honeybees, let's just say it's volatile. But the thing is, honeybees are new here. They're not native to the Americas. They were brought to the Pacific Northwest sometime after 1850 for honey production, and they weren't really managed for pollination until after World War II. Until relatively recently, there were enough wild bees in the landscape that we didn't have to think about pollination. And now they're gone. So, where are they? And this brings us to the concept of population reservoirs. If the bees that live in farmland, that can live in farmland, have left, then we have to hope that they're hanging on somewhere else, on the edges, like in marginal lands, in forgotten places. Places like this. This is my house. You can't see me because the camellia is in the way. The flowers are pretty, but I want to draw your attention to the rocks. If you get in close, they're full of bees. These are andrena, sometimes called mining bees, and as you might guess from the name, they live in the dirt. These specialize in flowers that bloom early in the season. And they're solitary bees in the sense that each female digs her own nest, gathers her own pollen, lays her own eggs. They don't share very much, but if a patch of dirt is good for one bee, it's often good for a lot of them. They make good neighbors. Now, I've seen about 10 species of mining bees around my house over the years. I haven't always been able to find nests, but when I do, they're on the edges of what you might call managed space, between the rocks, under the sidewalk, in bare patches on the lawn. And they do pretty well. One of the ways to tell if you've got a healthy population is the presence of specialized visitors. The bigger bug on the upper left isn't a bee. It's a bombyliid fly. It pretends to be a bee, and then it eats them. That white thing under its tail is basically a cannon. The larvae hatch out inside the mother, and she shoots them into the entrance of a bee nest from several inches away. And you might think, oh no, that's bad, it's eating bees. But parasites are actually a reliable marker of a healthy population. If things aren't going well, they leave. And speaking of the web of life, there are other hazards too. This little girl set a trap in front of a nest. It didn't work. The bee pulled away without much trouble. But yeah, it's worth a try. This is Anthophora, a digger bee. It's not a particularly close relative of the mining bees, but English only has so many words for bee that lives in the dirt. And again, it's somebody's yard, Elise's yard actually, in a patch of unattended earth. And this is Halictus, a sweat bee. She's still a ground nester, but the people who name things just gave up after a while. She lives in the canyon in between a couple of paving stones. And again, the lifestyle does have its risks. This one delved too greedily and too deep. Seattle is light on eldritch horrors, but it does have ants, and this nest didn't make it. And I want to make clear, bees aren't looking for gardens. They're not looking for curated spaces. They have their own opinions about what counts as good land. So for my last little story, I mentioned earlier that I've worked on some survey projects. We spent a few years watching some marginal places around Seattle, street shoulders, power line right-of-ways, and an old abandoned golf course. And one of the most interesting things I saw, one of the most encouraging things I saw really, was on what was essentially a construction site. One morning, we showed up to one of our survey sites, and the soil was gone. The landowner had a plan and had sent in crews with heavy machinery to strip the topsoil from about 1,000 square yards of earth. And then the plans changed, and the crews went off to do other things. And they just left this very large, very shallow hole in the ground. And this had all happened since our last visit to the site, so at most a month. We were, let's call it dismayed, but we went in to have a look anyway, and mixed in with the new grass, we saw these little mounds of dirt. I forgot to drop a ruler when I took the picture, so the scale isn't obvious, but these little mounds are 12 to 18 inches apart in this vast stretch of bare land. There were thousands of them. And when we stepped in to take a closer look, a bee looked out from every one. And these are sweat bees again. Now, it's worth pointing out these are not honeybee hives. We're not talking about thousands of bees per nest. Most likely there's only one, but there were thousands of nests. And the red bee here is Sphacodes. She's a nest parasite, a cuckoo bee. And her trick is to sneak into somebody else's nest, find an egg with its pollen supply, and lay her own egg on top. Her egg hatches first, and the larvae eats everything in sight, so not super popular with the other bees. The little sweat bee isn't having it, so the Sphacodes is moving on. But I want to call out how amazing this is. This aggregation of nesting sweat bees, like 10,000 bees, probably more. And it's not just the bees, it's their parasites too. All of them. Here's another bombyliid fly making a bombing run. And this entire thing is 3 weeks old, 4 weeks old. I mean, there were bees in the ground before the crew went in, but nothing like this. And on that note, like I said, the original venue for this talk was called Science on Tap, but all I've done so far is tell some stories and sort of virtually wave my hands around. And I was a little tempted to leave it at that, but they say that science is just messing around but taking good notes, and we took a lot of notes. And I'm happy to say that we got them published a few weeks ago in Ecology and Evolution, Volume 15, Issue number 9. It's new enough that I don't know the page numbers yet. But some of the results are kind of interesting and relevant to what we're talking about, so I'd like to drop them in. So these are fresh results, hot off the virtual press. Now, our first question was, how many bees are there? Like, how many kinds of bees? Well, we spent a couple of years putting names to every bee that we could, and at the end, the list was 119 bees long, so at least that many. But here's the thing, we were only out there about once a month, and we never stopped finding new bees. So the question is, if we'd been looking for them full time, if we'd really found all of them, how many would that have been? Well, we sent our data to Riley Anderson, who's a stats guy at WSU, and turns out he could give us a pretty good answer, combining all 3 sites and adding in a few species that we only found by sweeping with a net, about 140. But there's a catch. That's only the bees that we can put a name to. There are 2 large groups of parasitic bees, Nomata and Sphacodes, that are effectively undescribed in the Pacific Northwest. It's very, very hard to put names to them. So we literally don't know how many species we found, and there's no one out there who can tell us. But it was a lot. Our best guess is that we found about 30 species in those 2 groups, and if we'd spent more time and done more sweeping, we'd have found more. So we think the real number is about 180 species across 3 sites. And the relevant bit here is that, again, these are not special places. They were broken, weedy. They're what the ecologists call disturbed. And there were still 180 species of wild bees. And the neat bit here is that because we know how far our samples were spread out, we can make informed guesses about other weedy bits of Seattle. Do you have a yard? Did you remember not to poison the bees in it? Then there are probably about 40 nameable species that you can see from your door. And if that's not enough, go for a walk. Just by taking a loop around your block, you double the expected number of species, up to 80 or so. And if you cover your whole neighborhood, say a square kilometer or so, then it goes up again to about 100. That's about half the species of the entire Puget Sound lowlands, all within walking distance. But you could ask, are all neighborhoods created equal? If you're the type to read legends, you could ask if BPF is really different from POS and SCL. It kind of looks like it is, and well, you might think so. For one thing, it's up near Payne Field, while POS is down by SeaTac and SCL is near the mouth of the Duwamish. They stand for Boeing Payne Field, Port of Seattle, and Seattle City Light, if you're curious. And the answer is yes. It turns out that SeaTac and the Duwamish have pretty similar bees. The difference might just be that the SeaTac site was bigger, but Everett is genuinely different. And it's not just that there were fewer bees, which was true, if only barely. They're different bees. South Seattle and Everett are different reservoirs, and albeit accidentally, they are protecting slightly different populations of bees. So here's another way to look at that. So every genus of bees gets its own color here. And for every site, we've got a vertical line. The bars to the right show how many species we found, and the bars to the left show how many individual bees relative to other bees at the site. And you can see a few things right off. For one thing, our aggregate data looks an awful lot like the Port of Seattle. And that's because we sampled at the port every year of the study, and it wound up providing well more than half of our total data. The other two sites are noticeably different. And it's also kind of cool to see how diversity and abundance do not line up. Up at the top, that red bar, Andrena is a genus of mining bees. And you can see, the bar to the right is pretty long. We found about as many species of mining bees as anything else, especially in the spring. But the bar to the left hardly exists. We found very few individual bees. A lot of those species were only represented by 2 or 3 bees each. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got Halictus. That's that big peach-colored bar in the middle. We only found 3 species, but they were all over the place, especially one species, Halictus tripartitus. Literally half of all the bees that we found across the entire study were this one species of tiny sweat bee, and most of them were at the port. And if you're curious, the honeybees are that little orange dot, second from the bottom. There's one species, Apis mellifera, and I'll get back to them in a minute. And this is just cool. These are the major genera of bees that we found with a little graph that shows when we found them. So bee season in Seattle runs from March through September. There are a few bees that are around the whole time, but most of them are seasonal. And a few of them are what we call bivoltines. So they have a peak and then later in the season another peak. And I should note that the curves here are normalized, so the colored area is always the same. So just looking at the graphs here, you might think that there's more Panorgynous than, say, Ceratina, and that's very much not the case. So the number of individuals in each genus is that column over on the right edge. So 13,000 Halictus. And finally, I'd like to talk about the bees that we didn't see, because in some ways they're as important as the ones that we did. Now, we think there are about 200 species around the margins, around our margins in the Puget Sound lowlands. Maybe a little bit more, but not much. And we didn't find them all, but with all the time and across all the weedy places, not just our 3, we think that 200-ish is about the limit. And there's about 600 in the States, so we missed about 400 species. Now, we figure that about 300 of those only live on the east side of the Cascades, so missing them here isn't a problem. but there's still about 100 that we'd have liked to see. And we didn't, and we think we wouldn't. We think they're not here, or at least not in the kind of place that we were looking. We did find one big clue. The bees we found tended to be generalists. Generalist bees know how to learn which flowers are good to visit, and then learn how to visit them. In contrast, specialist bees know a lot about one kind of plant, or maybe a few kinds of plant, and they really want to be there. They don't like to compete with the crowds down at the blackberry bush or whatever. And that's the thing. Generalist bees are better able to exploit generalist flowers. Weedy places support weedy bees. Those 100 species need something that our weedy places don't provide. And we don't really know what it is, or if they're finding it somewhere else, or if they're already locally extinct. But we do know one thing. Native plants are good for native pollinators. The more, the merrier. And none of that was really unexpected, but one of the missing bees genuinely surprised us. The honeybees were somewhere else. And just to be clear, we could see beehives from one of our sites. They live here, but when they went out to gather food, they went away. And if you think about it, honeybees are playing a different game than everything else. Their hives are large enough to specialize, so they can send scouts out across a huge area, miles across. They can find the very best plants and really work them over. Honeybees hit the jackpot every day. And these marginal places, there are no jackpots here. There's no irrigation, no gardens, no orchards, just rain. And maybe some runoff, and whatever plants can get by on their own. And there's been some concern that honeybees are out-competing the native bees. And in some ways they probably are, but they're not doing it here. These edge places, these marginal places, they've just been left to the natives. So, what can you do? Don't poison the bees. That's really the first thing. Insecticides work, so avoid them. And be lazy. Leave some bare patches of earth. Let the leaves fall. Don't fuss too much about the lawn. Bees are good at finding the places they like, and they tend to like places that we ignore. Also, remember that most bees nest in the ground, and the whole point of mulch is to create a barrier between the ground and the sky, and it works. Now, sometimes mulch is necessary, but be judicious. Go easy on it. If you're in a position to plant things, plant natives. There are plenty of good lists online, the Xerces Society, Washington Department of Agriculture, Oregon State, and it can take some effort to get native plants established, and mulch can help, but it's absolutely worth the work. If you're the joining sort, take a look at the Washington Bee Atlas. I mentioned that we're finally making a serious effort to count the bees statewide, and that's the atlas. Washington and Oregon are actually out in front on this, and if the results are good, we can set a national example. We can really set the ball rolling. So it's worth doing. I do have one specific recommendation relevant to this talk. If you join the atlas, consider staying home, at least some of the time. A lot of our volunteers run up into the mountains or down to the coast, and they count all the bees in the pretty places. And that's great, but the cities matter too. Not just because they serve as population reservoirs, but also because urban farming is a thing, and it will probably become more important in the coming years. And the more we know, the more we can help. And of course, there's us, the Washington Native Bee Society. We're only a few years old, and we're already doing quite a bit of education and some coordination of public and private research and conservation efforts around native bees. Donations are appreciated, of course, but our meetings are free, and we're glad to have you here. So I'd like to thank Dr. Evan Sugden, who was my partner for the survey work, Dr. Riley Anderson, who did most of our data analysis and made all the cool figures, the Common Acre, who coordinated the project with all the landowners, the Bullet Foundation, who paid for a lot of it, Flickr for putting pictures of sandwiches under the GPL, J.R.R. Tolkien for writing things that are worth stealing, and all y'all for showing up. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. That we were on mute, but we were laughing and enjoying it very much. Thank you. We look forward to seeing everyone next month.
See everybody then.
All right. Bye now.